Welcome to today's webinar. My name is Gerard Mansour and I'm the Commissioner for Senior Victorians and Ambassador for Elder Abuse Prevention. And thank you for joining us on what is today the World Elder Abuse Awareness Day, celebrated around the world on the 15th of June. And when I say celebrated, I probably should say acknowledged. It's a very significant issue for us to think about the abuse of older people. I'd like to start today by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land we're meeting on today, and their elders past and present, and any emerging elders, and acknowledge all of those people that are listening in on their webinar today who might be from Aboriginal descent and Torres Strait Islander descent. So thank you very much for joining us today. And we've got a really important program today. We've got a keynote address by Professor Joe Ibrahim, who will be talking to us about some of the key features of elder abuse, and the opening address very shortly by the Honourable Luke Donnellan. I'd like to just point out a couple of the housekeeping features. We are taking a number of questions today live because an important part of today's webinar will be a panel session hosted by Gary Ferguson from Seniors Rights Victoria. And so without any further ado, I'd like to hand over to the Minister, Honourable Luke Donnellan, Minister for Ageing, Disability and Carers, to welcome us to today's webinar.
It's World Elder Abuse Awareness Day. There are now more than 920,000 Victorians over the age of 65. That's around a sixth of our population. Older Victorians are partners, parents, grandparents, friends and mentors. They deserve respect and dignity in their latter years, as well as support to participate fully in our community. But sadly, we know far too many older Victorians are suffering behind closed doors. Put simply, elder abuse is a form of family violence, and there is no place for it in our community. As you know, it is a sensitive and often hidden issue that can take many forms. Financial abuse appears to be one of the most common. It's estimated that around 2 to 14% of older people experience elder abuse in any given year. The reality is these figures are likely much higher due to underreporting, and given the current restrictions, we know that many older members of our community will be feeling more isolated or vulnerable and are not able to seek help as readily. This, coupled with so many people facing greater stress and hardship, I'm confident you share my concerns about the potential rise of elder abuse at the moment, which is why your work is so important. I'm sure you have all faced increased personal difficulties too, and the huge challenges we've had to make our lives and the way we work simpler. I'd like to thank you all for your efforts and expertise in providing care and support to our older Victorians. Your ongoing advocacy for the rights of older people and your dedication to preventing and responding to elder abuse is critical in ensuring that older Victorians receive the support they need when they need it. As a health, aged or community services professional, you're in a unique position to identify people at risk of or experiencing elder abuse. I hope today's webinar will be of benefit to you professionally and help us both prevent and better respond to elder abuse going forward. The Victorian Government funds a range of elder abuse initiatives. This includes the statewide elder abuse helpline delivered by Senior Rights Victoria, the trial of an integrated model of care for responding to suspected elder abuse, as well as the 10 elder abuse prevention networks. We are proud to announce that the Andrews Labor Government will be providing $1.147 million to continue services provided by Senior Rights Victoria and the Seniors Information Outreach through CODA. A further $120,000 will be provided to the Office of Public Advocate to identify options to safeguard at-risk adults as part of Victoria's commitment to the National Plan. This is very good news, and I know something that many of you have been advocating for. I'd like to thank you again for all that you do and for taking part in today's webinar, which is jointly delivered by the Department of Health and Human Services and Senior Rights Victoria. Now more than ever, we need to look out for each other.
Thanks very much, Minister, for that welcome and that address. Since 2016, we've been involved in a process of change here in Victoria, as the Victorian Government has responded to the Family Violence Royal Commission and set in place a number of changes. And one of the changes that it undertook was to ask me, as in my role as Commissioner, to broaden that role and allocate some of my time and some of my commitment to a role as Ambassador for Elder Abuse Prevention. And I'd like to make a couple of comments opening today's webinar about that and some of my experiences since the end of 2016. And the first is to acknowledge that we've actually come quite a long way in a short period of time. Whilst the dominant part of the government response has had to be focused on the critical issues of family violence that led to the Royal Commission, it's clear that there are developments in relation to elder abuse and elder abuse prevention that are very clearly on the radar today. We've got the campaign just launched recently by Respect Victoria, which is a rerun of last year's campaign in calling out elder abuse and improving the knowledge of our community about what elder abuse is and how it exists and the different forms that it takes. I spend a lot of time as a commissioner and ambassador out in the local community talking with groups of older people. And one of my reflections, if I turn back the clock and say about 5 or 6 years ago prior to the Royal Commission, if I was to have a group of say 100 older people in a room talking to me and I asked them a question, how many of them had an understanding of elder abuse, there wouldn't have been many hands go up. At best 10 to 15 people at that stage, I'd say numerically on average, had an understanding out of every 100 people about what constitutes elder abuse. If I was to conduct that same forum today, nearly half of those hands would go up. That's a really significant progress and a significant amount of change to make because, of course, we can't prevent elder abuse unless we raise awareness, particularly amongst older people and the families in our community more widely, about the very nature and aspects of what elder abuse is. And so I think it's really important on a day like today to acknowledge the concerted combined effort of so many people and organisations, from peak bodies like CODA, specialist organisations like Seniors Rights Victoria, many of the community legal centres, the work of Family Safety Victoria, so many hospitals, the prevention networks, integrated models. So you can see with so many shoulders to the grindstone why we've moved so far in what is a fairly short period of time. But of course I'd be the first to acknowledge that we've got a long way to go, that our community much more widely only has a very limited understanding of what constitutes elder abuse, and hence the campaign by Respect Victoria is a really important part of that longer term education strategy. When I talk with older people, one of the things that they raise and bring to my attention very quickly is the impact of ageism on them and their lives. And I think it takes a couple of forms. The first is, and it's a very common experience of older people, to feel that as they get older, as they go through that journey of aging, there's a word that they often raise with me, and the word is invisibility. There's a sense that as they age, as they go through that journey, they become more and more invisible to the community around them. That in lots of ways they're not seen in the same way as they were and acknowledged in the same way as they were in their younger years. And so on a day like today, when we think about prevention of elder abuse, it's really important to remember that our society has some change that it still needs to make. That part of the reason we have elder abuse is that we don't value and respect older people in the way that we ought to respect them. And a critical starting point for that is the way older people experience their lives and experience on a day-to-day basis the whole issue of invisibility and the sense that our community doesn't recognise and respect them in the same way as they did at other parts of their journey in life. And so today I put out a challenge to each of us as individuals. We are all part of family networks, friendship networks, community networks, and we can all, with our own behaviours, make an enormous difference and impact. We can do it as professionals and we can do it as individuals. We can actually take a stand and in a very polite, appropriate way, call out ageism in all its forms as we see it and experience it in our lives. Sometimes it's very inadvertent and unintentional. People who don't realise and they've got used to the fact that they don't value older people in the way that they ought to. And so on a day like today, I think there are fundamentally two challenges. The first is an individual challenge. And I often finish my talks with older people reminding them that they themselves are agents of change. They don't have to accept a situation where a community doesn't value them in the way that they believe is appropriate, and that they can take a stand and stand up for themselves. And the other part of that is us as individuals, that we can all make a difference, have an impact on the communities in which we live with our loved ones. But the other part of it is the long-term process of community change. And I think one of the most important things as professionals we can do is to inform older people that they have rights, that they have a right to be respected, and that help and support is available. And whether it's going to an organisation like Seniors Rights Victoria, to a local community legal service, whether it's ringing 1-800-RESPECT, there is a place for older people to go and receive assistance. And of course, if it's a more serious and critical and urgent matter, they would ring 000 and involve the Victoria Police. And so today it's really important for us to bear in mind that older people, just like all ages in our community, have rights, and those rights ought to be upheld and respected. And now I've got great pleasure in introducing our keynote speaker, Professor Joe Ibrahim. And Joe is a professor at the Department of Forensic Medicine, Monash University, Victorian Institute of Forensic Medicine, where he's head of the Health, Law and Ageing Research Unit, an adjunct professor at Australian Centre for Evidence-Based Aged Care, La Trobe University, and a practising senior consultant specialist in geriatric medicine with over 30 years experience. We could have picked no better person to do today's keynote address. Welcome, Joe.
Thanks, Jared. It's a privilege to be here today. One of the beauties of webinars is you can be in your PJs doing the laundry or washing the dishes. Hopefully the talk will be interesting enough that you'll pay attention to what I've got to say today. One of the first things I want to mention is elder abuse is about a loss of trust or a breach of trust. And the question I have to all of us is, why should older people trust us? What have we done to build or gain their confidence? Where is the evidence that we mean them well? Usually I'd be presenting data. What I've learnt over the past 20 years is that when I produce data, people say there's too little, so there isn't a problem. Or if there's too much data and the problem looks too big, then it's far too big to address. So what I'm going to do today is talk through 5 main issues and ideas that I want you to take away with you. The primary reason for looking at these 5 ideas is to reassure you, convince you, get you to advocate for why we should change and why we should be addressing elder abuse. The first point I want to make is you don't need to like older people to respect them. The second point I'll look at is the COVID-19 pandemic and how this has highlighted the inequalities in our society, and particularly in relation to elder abuse. The third is to look at understanding the person and to look beyond what you see. And in understanding the person, we'll use the examples of the culturally and linguistically diverse populations in our country. The fourth point is to look at understanding that we're a guest in a person's life, particularly as a health professional, and we need to remember that we're a guest. The fifth and final issue is that elder abuse is a wicked problem, and it's wicked in 2 ways. One, it is a harmful, hurtful and bad thing. The second is the term wicked is often used for a problem that can't be easily solved because it requires behaviour change. So I'll go into those 5 issues with you now and hopefully do that within the remaining 18 minutes. Elder abuse is defined as a breach of trust, and that breach of trust usually relates to family or close friendships. But there is also a breach of trust between us as a society and the older person. One of the reasons problems remain hidden, and we often refer it to hidden because there is no action. And elder abuse isn't actually hidden, it's just that we're not working towards a solution. The reasons we work towards a solution is because we like someone, or we identify with the person, or we think that the situation is unfair. And I come back to this idea that you don't need to like an older person to respect their rights. We all think babies are cute. We don't think all older people are cute. nor do older people like being called cute. Older people have lived 60, 70, 80, 90 years. They're often twice, 3 times as old as we are. They've had a lot of life experience. They've had both the positive and the negative. They've developed their opinions. They've developed their views. They become sometimes strident in what they say and how they say it. We don't always agree with what they say. That doesn't mean they don't have the right to say or the right to be respected. The other reason that we sometimes struggle with elder abuse is we can't imagine what it's like to be old, so we don't identify and we don't think it's a problem. We can identify with being a child and we can empathise with a child. It's much harder to empathise with someone who's 90 with arthritis or dementia. We don't know what that's like and we tend to shy away from it. We do understand what is fair, and this is what we need to now be acting on, is what is fair. Using the French liberation, where the term liberty, equality, fraternity is very important in understanding what we should be doing to make things better. The French Revolution was about respecting the rights of the individual. It talks about equality, that we all deserve to be treated the same. And it talks about fraternity, and fraternity here means a moral obligation to each other. It's not meant to be a gender-specific term, but a term that says we care about each other, we care about our society, and so we would do well to remember those 3 terms and to look to that as the reason to be addressing elder abuse. Elder abuse is family violence. It's often a crime, and it's not fair and does need to be addressed. Moving on now to the issue of COVID-19 pandemic, and we've lived through that, and we've been fortunate in Australia that the devastation that's occurred overseas hasn't affected us to the same extent. It has affected us, though, in terms of being quarantined at home. And as with any natural disaster, it highlights inequalities, that the poorer people, the more vulnerable populations, are more likely to suffer or be exploited in those situations. The isolation that's occurred means that older people at home aren't getting the support that they need, or that if they are victims or survivors of elder abuse, that this is happening behind closed doors. There are plausible reasons why you can't be visited. The level of mental and emotional distress that occurs in this situation heightens people's willingness to do the right thing, as well as heightens their willingness to do the wrong thing. Our social networks break down. We're not seeing each other. We're not seeing our social networks. We're not seeing the community networks that we normally would. Communicating by telephone or video conferencing is not the same as talking to a person. We don't have that same sense of compassion or reality, or the ability to believe that someone will help us in person as to what they say on the phone. Our normal social structures, the government, law enforcement, other agencies are preoccupied with managing the COVID-19 pandemic, and so their focus isn't on elder abuse to the extent it would have been in the past. So this increases the opportunity for fraud and bad behaviour to occur. And we must remember that this was occurring before COVID, isn't just a product of the pandemic, and isn't something that's going to go away when the pandemic eventually resolves. And so we need to be paying attention to the issue and the heightened issue of elder abuse for the next 18 to 24 months while we wait for the pandemic to resolve. The third issue I wanted to talk to you about is understanding the person. As health professionals and as people, we all like to think that We have an intuitive sense of a person and what to do when we meet someone, and that we can read people's emotions and perhaps even their thoughts and know what's good for them. Australia as a multicultural country is often misleading. We think because we understand that we're multicultural, that we understand different cultures. Just because I can go down and order some Vietnamese food doesn't mean I understand the Vietnamese culture. My family are from the Middle East, but we don't identify as Middle Eastern. We identify by the country and the region and the village that my parents come from. That's very specific. And when we meet someone from a culturally and linguistically diverse background, we fail ourselves, we fail them by labelling them as Middle Eastern or Asian or European or Anglo. And all of us know that there is no love lost between the English and the Irish, and you would never want to confuse the two. That there is no love lost between the Scots and the English. And even the northern and southern parts of England see themselves differently. Labelling people by their country of origin isn't sufficient to help us break through stereotypes. We need to understand what the values they have in those areas are, what they value more than the other. Some people value the individual's rights, others value family, and others value the community, and they're willing to trade or compromise for that greater good or what they fundamentally believe in. The issues then around the lived experience, particularly with the culturally and linguistically diverse, as well as the LGBTI population, is we need to remember that society as it is today was very different 20, 50 years ago when older people were growing up. If you've escaped communism or a dictatorship or famine and hardship from another country to come to Australia, you've given up a lot to come here. You're not likely to be willing to say that it's been a mistake to have changed your life so dramatically. And nor are you likely to have the same degree of faith in the police or the government if you've come from a country that was in disrepair and did not respect you. People from East Germany will not have a great love for the police given the Stasi and the secret police that existed there. So asking someone from that background to now have faith in the police is a difficult ask. The other thing is that people that have had these lived experiences know more about the world and what it means to sacrifice, and they know more about the trade-off for them personally than we do from what we've been taught at medical school, nursing school, or at allied health colleges. And so we need to be wary that because we've been taught about culture does not mean that we actually understand it, nor do we understand the individual. So that's what I mean by, and the other issue then on LGBTI is that, you know, within my own livelihood, within my own life, we've seen dramatic changes that have occurred in how this sector has been treated by the community, and the reprehensible approach towards LGBTI in the 50s and 60s, where it was considered as a disease, means that older people will not want to or not readily trust institutions or the medical profession. And they may not be willing to share those aspects of their lives now and do not want them disclosed to others. So I think respecting the person and understanding we are a guest in their life is important. To succeed as a health professional, so to succeed as a health professional, we need to be looking at What is it the person wants? And to be looking at elder abuse not as a disease. A disease has a single underlying problem often, and it has a specific treatment. Elder abuse is not a disease with an easy answer. There are multiple components behind it. Understanding the history of what led to the elder abuse, what the person, the victim or survivor wants, should guide our actions, and understanding that the older person has to live it is what guides us with the direction. Building trust, because elder abuse is about a loss of trust. If a mother or father have lost trust with their son or their daughter, why is it that we think that we can automatically gain their trust in a single consultation? We need to rebuild trust, and we do that by meeting with people, talking with them, remaining consistent, and acting in a way that reassures them that we have their best interests at heart, not that we are trying to enforce a solution on them. So always remember that we're a guest in someone's life. We've been invited in, and not to abuse that trust, because that it would be far more devastating and will mean that we are unable to help address the problem. The fifth is to look at this issue of a wicked problem. Now, a wicked problem was coined in the 1970s to explain the types of problems that have multiple factors that bear on their cause, that they need to be addressed, so you can't sit and wait to find a single specific answer. It needs us to be working together. That we need the police, the lawyers, the doctors, the nurses, the social workers, and the community working together to make the person's life better for them. And better is how they define as better, not how we determine it. Working together is something we often take for granted, and we think we do that well. In terms of elder abuse, it does take specific training and some knowledge around what each discipline is able to do and bring to the table, and recognising that we all have our own worldviews about how a problem can be managed. What do I do tomorrow as a healthcare worker? I need to listen. I need my patient or resident or client to trust me. I need to understand that the possibility of elder abuse exists, and it's not going to present with someone walking in and saying, I am a victim of elder abuse. That is not how older people see themselves. It's not how people will present. They will come in with symptoms of distress, anxiety, fear, not coping. And we need to be thinking then, is this due to an action related to the family that is creating this distress? We need to be able to explore options with them about what they want and what is possible. And we need to be genuine. We can't be making promises we can't keep, because I remind you that at the essence of elder abuse is trust and a breach of trust. And so we have a wary patient. And so we need to be able to demonstrate that trust. We need to build a relationship. Building a relationship takes time. And the point here is that, and to remember that we all struggle sometimes with what we want from our lives. And if we don't know what we want for ourselves, we need to be very circumspect about telling other people how they should live their lives. What we need is a compassionate approach, an approach that takes into account the personality, the wishes, the stage of life someone is at. At the age of 90, I might be willing to compromise on some choices because I don't have very long to live, which I might not be willing to do at the age of 30 or 50. what's important to me when I'm 90 and holding on to my family because there is nothing else means that I'm willing to trade or compromise far more than I might if I'm an idealist at 25. So as a health professional, when we go to work later today or tomorrow, remember that people are looking to us for compassion. They're looking for us to be trustworthy, that when they trust us, we do not breach that trust, and that we are acting according to their wishes and listening to what it is that they want, even if it's not necessarily something that you would want for yourself, because it's not your life, it's their life, and they're the ones that have to live it. So I thank you for listening to this short talk, and I wish you well. And this is really just the first step towards a massive social change that needs to occur across the world and is mirrored in the struggle that we've had for the rights of children, for the rights of victims of sexual abuse, for women's rights, and obviously for civil rights. Elder abuse is part of our social justice and is part of our human rights, and that means we need to respect ourselves and respect others. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Joe, for that enormously thought-provoking presentation. It reminds me a lot of my own initial professional training. I originally trained as a youth worker. Back then we would have used a term very often and very commonly, the word empowerment. The sense that the most important thing we could do as professionals who are working in any of the service systems or service sectors, do our best to empower people to take as much control over their life and their life decisions as possible. And I'd like to take this opportunity to acknowledge the generosity of the people that Joe is referring to and that I find in my role. Those people are so generous in sharing their life stories with people like me. That helps me get a better understanding of the challenges that each individual has so that we can build a much more better comprehensive understanding of what's happening in the lives of people that are experiencing abuse, but also how to apply that learnings to things like prevention campaigns. So I'd like to very much acknowledge the contributions of victim survivors and their bravery and their resilience in dealing with what is often many, many years of life experience of challenge before they finally disclose in some way to us. And so the words that Joe talked about in terms of compassion and an understanding is such an important attribute and a trait for us to display as professionals when an older person does finally get to the point of just acknowledging the abuse that's occurring in their life before they can start a conversation about what pathways might be open to them. And so now we're going to shift to another level and another phase of our webinar. And I'd like to bring up for you all a slide about how you can connect with us using Slido. And while you're looking at the Slido screen, and you can log in using the initials of our day, WEAAD, to log in. It's an opportunity for you to ask your questions about things that are going to occur through the panel shortly, or anything that Joe might have talked about in terms of his opening address. And whilst you're seeing the Slido slide, we're going to have a changeover in the panel. And I'm very pleased to introduce that Gary Ferguson, Communities Education Manager with Senior Rights Victoria, is going to take over and introduce each of the panel members for you. Thank you.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Gary Ferguson. I am the Education Coordinator at Seniors Rights Victoria. This morning I'll be hosting a panel discussion on a case study that is typical of the sorts of case studies that we see at Seniors Rights Victoria. Before I begin, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we're meeting and pay my respects to their elders past and present and those who continue the journey. Okay, it's reasonable for parents to want to help their children in times of crisis, regardless of the age of the children. Often older parents will help out their adult children when they are having difficulties. However, on some occasions, adult children can exploit their parents' goodwill. and help themselves. In a moment, we're going to discuss a case study with an expert panel. In the case study, we'll hear of a retired couple, Basilius and Violet, healthy and active, and living in their family home. Recently, and with their agreement, one of their adult sons, Petros, has moved back home. These arrangements can start okay. However, as we see with this situation, it's gone wrong. Before we commence the discussion on the case study, let me introduce you to the panel. So beginning closest to me, Sergeant Natasha Powers is from Victoria Police and is a Senior Sergeant Family Violence Training Officer with the Centre of Family Violence, a role which arose as a result of recommendations from the Royal Commission into Family Violence. In this role, Natasha is focused on providing contemporary specialist family violence training and education, equipping Victoria Police staff with the knowledge, skills and confidence to deliver high-quality response, investigation and prosecution of reports of family violence. Natasha, or as she prefers to be called Tash, has wide-ranging training experience with the specialist family violence sector external to Victoria Police and has guest lectured on the police response to family violence at Melbourne University, RMIT and Monash University and with the Domestic Violence Resource Centre of Victoria. Next to her is Tony Law. Tony is the coordinator of the Advocates team at Seniors Rights Victoria. Tony holds qualifications in social work, law and mediation and has worked in advocacy and support across numerous government and not-for-profit settings, along with policy development. Tony has worked with a broad range of individuals, however her niche and passion is working with vulnerable, marginalised and disadvantaged older people, along with their families and carers, in respect to the older person's physical and mental health and social well-being. Next to her is Michelle Lord. Michelle has had several roles at Southern Melbourne Primary Care Partnership over a period of 11 years. She now leads one of 10 elder abuse prevention networks in Victoria, funded by the Victorian Government. She is a member of the Elder Abuse and Safeguarding Advisory Group, and Michelle is currently developing a primary prevention of elder abuse framework on behalf of the Department of Health and Human Services. Next to her is Tinos Dubos-Stathopoulos, who is the CEO, Chief Executive Officer of Pronia. She has 28 years service in the community service sector with extensive knowledge and expertise in working with the Australian Greek and broader ethnic communities. She has expertise in the management of diverse culturally responsive programs in the area of aged care, family and children, direct services and health and community education. Tina is a strong advocate for multicultural affairs through policy work and representation on various national, state and local government committees. And next to her is Dr. Caroline Fisher, who is the Family Safety Team Lead and Psychology Advisor at Royal Melbourne Hospital and the Psychology Advisor and Chief Neuropsychologist at the Melbourne Clinic. She has over 15 years experience as a clinical neuropsychologist, 25 peer-reviewed research publications, and has worked for the last 3 years as part of the Strengthening Hospital Responses to Family Violence State Government Initiative. She sits on the Elder Abuse Integrated Model of Care Implementation Committee at Melbourne Health. Welcome to you all. Okay, before we get underway, what I'm going to say is a couple of things in relation to this case study and questions you might have. Firstly, these sorts of discussions can sometimes emotionally upset people, and so what we would suggest to you if that occurs is that you contact our telephone helpline on 1300 368 821. Equally, the other thing I wanted to say is that we may not be able to get to all the questions at the end of this discussion, And so again, what we would encourage you to do is to contact the telephone helpline, and the number I will give to you at the end of this session to speak to one of our advocates or lawyers if you have any questions that we don't get to today. Before I came into the room, one of the DHHS staff told me to mention that there are some noise issues and sound issues in relation to this recording, and we're trying to fix that at the moment, so I apologise if that's the case. Alright, so let's move on to the case study. And the case study is about a couple, Vasilius and Violet. Vasilius is 70 years of age, and up until 4 years ago was working part-time as a sales rep. Until recently, he was an enthusiastic golf player and swam 2 to 3 times each week at the local pool. Violet is 68 years of age and finished working as a bookkeeper at 65 years of age. She's well connected in the local community, attending exercise programs and volunteering at the local lunch group. They have a long-term marriage. Vasilius migrated from Greece during the 1960s as a teenager with his parents. Since the restrictions have come into effect because of COVID-19, Vasilius and Violet are spending much more time at home, in self-isolation. Vasilius and Violet have 2 sons, Robert and Petros. Robert is in a long-term relationship with 1 child, and Petros' marriage broke down 2 years ago, and his former wife obtained a family violence intervention order against him. Petros has never told his parents about the intervention order. So, Tash, if I can ask you first, Petros' wife applied for an intervention order, alleging that he had a gambling problem and became verbally and physically abusive when he experienced financial stress. What sort of involvement might the Victoria Police have had in this intervention order?
The involvement from police is really dependent on how we become aware of the intervention order being applied for. So if a person chooses to contact police at the point of an incident occurring, then we would obviously take reports in relation to that and investigate that matter. The information provided in this example indicates that the intervention order is self-initiated, so I'm assuming that Petros' wife has gone to the court herself and made an application for the intervention order. Police won't have any involvement up to the point where the intervention order is sent to the local police station for service on Petros. And what would happen then is, as we receive those orders, we will read through the content of the application and the basis for that application and make contact with Petros in relation to serving the intervention order on him. So it might be that police will receive the intervention order and make a phone call to Petros to see if he wants to come into the police station and pick it up. Or we will make contact with him or attend his home address, whatever address details would be provided by the affected family member. So in terms of any further follow-up in relation to the allegations contained within that application, unless the affected family member specifically wanted police involvement and wanted a police investigation, we wouldn't investigate any of those allegations.
Okay. All right. Okay, very good, thank you. All right. So moving along in the case study, some 2 years ago, Petros borrowed a substantial amount of money from his parents to set up a business, or so he said. The repayment of the loan was a verbal arrangement, and Petros hasn't paid back any of the money. As you can imagine, this is causing stress to Vasilius, and although he wants to help his son, Vasilius is unhappy that Petros hasn't repaid any of the money. So Tina, you're the Chief Executive Officer of a peak organisation, Pronia, that works in the culturally and linguistically diverse community, specifically with Greek people. Are you aware of older parents helping their children in this or similar ways, regardless of their age? And what do you think are some of the reasons for this?
Well, definitely it's not an uncommon way of family members relating to each other. The parents play a very active role and are very involved in the lives of their children, and that could take the form of financial assistance or supporting families, so it's not uncommon at all. They want the best for their families, so I think that supporting them financially would be one way that they could do that. Obviously there's some issues there about communication and what the expectations are in relation to whatever discussions have taken place, and given that there's some issues for the individual, the parents obviously not feeling very confident and comfortable about raising the issue about how they might be compensated or that money returned. So, and that might relate to what's happened in terms of the marriage, the OVO. There might be some other issues there. So it's very difficult for people within, usually with families, to be able to engage in discussions that relate to financial issues, as well as anything that might relate to it and around that. So if there's any issues around violence or any issues around fights or other family-related matters, they're not easily understood and they're not easily communicated. So that will definitely cause some issues, I would say, for them.
And do you think, given that these things are not easily communicated between family members, that it's common for family members to seek mediation, or is that sort of something that doesn't really happen?
It's not taken outside of the family context. There may be some discussions, say, with other relatives at the time, but it's not something that's communicated easily, simply because people want to save face.
Yes.
Everything is kept within the family and they hope to problem solve within the family. The other difficulty is obviously not having language and not understanding systems. So going outside of what they know could be difficult for them, and they might not necessarily know where to go. So they try to problem solve within the context of the family.
Yeah, and so one of the things that we see at Seniors Rights Victoria, and I know that when I was growing up, for example, one of the codes that existed in our family was what you say in the family and is said in the family and happens in the family stays in the family, and you don't talk about it to anybody outside. And those codes can create a barrier for people to talk about these things, don't they?
Yes, and they want the best for their children, and that's the underlying issue for them. That it's about trying to work through and improve the situation for their adult son and for their family more broadly. So they think sometimes that they have the answers to that, and they like to think that they can do it, but it needs to sometimes go outside the family, and they require information which sometimes they don't have.
Yeah, and those sorts of things happen across families, I think, regardless of culture. Yeah. Okay, let's move on. So when COVID-19 restrictions came into effect, Petros was stood down from his job as a head waiter. He had to move from his rented shared accommodation when he had no income, and Vasilius and Violet agreed he would move into their home. As we found out, parents will often step in and help their children out regardless of their children's age. On this occasion, because of Petros' situation, it's understandable that Vasilius and Violet would agree to Petros' request. However, when parents have these requests, there are things that they can do to prevent elder abuse occurring. Now, Michelle, you work in elder abuse prevention at the Southern Melbourne Elder Abuse Prevention Network. Tell me what you think what prevention might play in this particular situation.
So, as one of the primary prevention networks, we focus on preventing violence, elder abuse before it occurs, which means that we work with whole communities rather than individuals themselves. We also do work very closely as a network with other organisations that focus on secondary prevention, which is people at risk, or tertiary prevention, which is people who have already experienced abuse. So in the space of primary prevention, we look at trying to influence healthy attitudes and behaviours that will help prevent elder abuse. And in this case, we know that some of the things that can influence whether or not elder abuse occurs are things such as ageism or even gender discrimination or other types of discrimination. So it's really important that we foster attitudes and behaviours that acknowledge older people's rights respect for older people. So it's definitely appropriate for Petros's parents to take him in and support him in a time of need. But equally, he has a responsibility to understand and respect his parents' rights as the householders. And he's more likely to do that if the wider community supports respectful attitudes towards older people and their rights.
Okay, thanks very much. We're having problems with the sound, so to avoid moving the microphone around a lot, what I'm going to do is move to the speakers that I'm speaking to. Will that be easier? No, maybe just put it there. Okay. Okay, so Tony, Seniors Rights Victoria is a free service. What's the age criteria?
The age criteria is for anyone aged 60 and above, and for Indigenous people aged 45 and above.
Okay. And so in this situation, you know, Vasilis and Violet might have been in a better position. This is obviously a crisis position. So they might have been in a better position where they had some time to think about it. Would they be able to contact Seniors Rights Victoria and talk about some of the issues they need to think about before they enter into the arrangement?
Yeah, absolutely, Gary. So if Violet happened to phone us on the helpline and I answer the phone as the advocate.
Yep.
So if I answer the phone on the helpline as one of the advocates, I would actually start off by informing Violet that that the conversation that we're going to have is actually confidential and it's not being recorded, so she's able to speak freely. I would have a discussion if she felt comfortable around how she felt about Petros returning home at this particular point in time, even though despite the COVID-19 situation and his loss of job, and I suppose get her to explore some of the positive things in terms of Petros returning home and also the negative side of things in terms of Petros moving back into the home. And some of the areas for consideration that I would ask Violet to consider is, you know, how long does she and Vasilios expect Petros to actually to be at home? How much will he contribute towards, say, board or food or bills? Also get them to think about how much he will pay and how often to the household expenses. And also another thing, apart from money, is whether or not Petros can actually have his friends come over to visit or stay overnight as well, because sometimes that can be impacting on their home environment as well. Also another big thing, and I appreciate this too, is around cooking and eating, you know, in terms of who's going to be, is Petros going to be there to help with that, or is it going to be separate arrangements? Also around household chores, so like is Petros actually going to be assisting with household chores, so, you know, like the cleaning and the cooking and other aspects, particularly shopping, given that they can't actually go out at the moment to shop because of the COVID-19 restrictions. Also another thing, I know some people feel a little bit uncomfortable about this, but whether or not Petros is actually able, if he drinks alcohol, is he allowed to consume alcohol in their home? Can he smoke or take drugs in their home if that's what he chooses to do? But they need to have that discussion with him. Also to think about what happens if things go bad, what happens if things don't work out, you know, in terms of how much notice are you going to give Petros to leave, and also to how will this notice occur and who will actually deliver that notice. So I suppose there's an awful lot to think about in terms of having Petros returning home. I would also let Violet know that we also have some resources at work that we can actually send out in terms of like caring for your assets booklet and adult returning home, in terms of that will just cover what I've just discussed with Violet, and to find out whether or not if it's okay to send those information documents to them at home, or whether or not there's somewhere else that we can send them to. So also to just to let her know that, you know, if she would like to have a free and confidential advice session with one of our lawyers and advocates together, well, we offer that as well.
Great, okay. Tony, that's very comprehensive, and that's a free service, as I said before. And one of the things that Seniors Rights Victoria does have around these particular matters is a booklet called Care for Your Assets. And those booklets can be posted free to people, can't
Correct,
they?
yes.
And even during COVID-19, we have people going into the office a couple of days a week. And so if you wanted a copy of Care for Your Assets, you would telephone the helpline. And if you didn't get all the things that Tony talked about in terms of the checklist is available in the booklet and gives you time to think about what you might need to agree to before someone moves home. All right.
Also forgot one thing. Also too, for preventative approaches, I would encourage people to get anything you verbally agree in writing, because when things do go bad, it's so much easier to assist.
Very good. Thank you very much. Okay. All right. Since Petros moved in, he hasn't contributed to paying his share of the bills, even though he's home all day. He doesn't help his parents out around the home. He's talked about suicide and sometimes becomes very aggressive towards both his parents. They fear for their safety at these times, and because of the COVID-19 restrictions, are unable to leave their house. So they stay in parts of the house where Petros doesn't go. Vasilios and Violet know Petros's actions aren't okay. However, they wouldn't necessarily identify this as elder abuse. And we particularly find this at Seniors Rights Victoria, that when people come to talk to us about their situation, they'll tell us about their concern, but they may not express it in terms of the word elder abuse. Michelle, back to you. As an expert in prevention, can you talk about how in raising awareness about elder abuse, you can ensure that people like Vasilios and Violet understand what it is?
Thanks, Gary. I think it's really important. When raising awareness of elder abuse to consider the background of the groups or the individuals that you're targeting. That can help inform the approach that you take, whether it's talking with community groups or peer education or even media campaigns. But it also helps with understanding the type of language that we use, which Gary just alluded to. We're all using the term elder abuse today, but that's not a term that's well understood in many communities. It can be quite confusing, it can be offensive for some communities, and it can be confusing. So for instance, in Aboriginal communities, the term elder doesn't necessarily mean older person, it has other significant meanings. So when we're considering Vasilios and Violet's case, I think it's important to consider areas where they may be having opportunities to have these discussions, which might be community groups that they're already attending, and thinking about the language that might be used that they can understand. So given their cultural background, it might be something like talking about dignity and respect in ageing, how do we involve the family, what happens when things go wrong, things that we've already alluded to, if that's more appropriate for their cultural background. I think Tina can probably comment more on that.
All right, so let's go across to Tina. So Tina, if you could just talk a little bit about how we might raise elder abuse within culturally and linguistically diverse communities, and maybe focusing a bit more specifically on this case.
Thanks, Gary. Elder abuse is not a very well understood issue, and it's quite confusing for many within the Greek community, like you had actually raised earlier on. And there are a number of cultural factors such as language and attitudes and expectations and perceived roles and the impact on the way that the elderly person relates with other members of their family. We find essentially when we raise the issue of elder abuse, you're right, people don't recognise that problems within the family as seen as elder abuse. Because they're seen, particularly the parents are seen that they're supporting and working with their children. So elder abuse is not something that they would expect that it would be defined, the relationships. We find that many older people are socially isolated. In the case of this case, they're not quite as isolated because they've been involved in community, but they have the potential actually now, given some of the issues, that their behaviours will change in the way that they socialise and the way they get on with their lives. So you will find that they will most likely become isolated in some ways because they are looking to also protect their son at the same time as trying to deal with those issues. We also find that in this case, and in a lot of the cases that we deal with, is they're not knowledgeable, the parents are not knowledgeable about what services and what information is available. So what works for us in our community when we work is to use simple, plain language around elder abuse and when we're defining it, and also making sure that we give the definition so that people can identify. Narratives work really well in relation to how people identify themselves. And they would then perhaps look for some way of reaching out and seeking information. We find that if you're wanting to talk to people more broadly or individuals, once they identify themselves, they're able to reach out for services. If it's in a critical and a crisis situation, that would usually be the police. In many other cases, it might be an organisation like ours, where they're looking to find out more information. Communication is important, so using ethnic media, radio or print media is a good way of communicating, or any other leaflets or information that would explain what it is that they're looking for. We also find that in similar cases with this one, the parents are very ambivalent about reaching out and getting support and talking about and taking action against their children to stop the violence. So you'll find that they will try to deal with it internally. Trust is very important, so trusting another service provider or trusting somebody within the community to actually engage with them and talk to them about their issues is really important. So service providers need to make sure that if English was an issue, that they would use an interpreter to be able to communicate what that, what the issues are for the family. And also provide information in their language, particularly to understand it. And in the case of Petros, perhaps also give some other information about some of the issues that impact him as well. Successful interventions for identifying, preventing and responding to elder abuse needs to be done in a culturally sensitive way. So really understand about where their family is coming from, what's important to them, what are their attitudes to family relationships will go a long way in working out what interventions might be able to be put in place.
Great. Thanks, Tina. That was very comprehensive, and thank you for that answer. I might just say too, we're just moving along the panel here. Now the cord's getting a bit stretched, but we're getting down this end of the panel now. I might just say too, I noticed that on the live feed that we're getting, there's a question or a request to talk about LGBTIQ older people in relation to elder abuse. And I'd just like to say that as an openly gay man, I know that for this population, the ageing issues are quite prominent. We're now seeing a significant part of that community who are ageing. And often that community has come through a period of significant marginalisation and discrimination, which may mean that it's a bit more difficult for them to talk about these issues, particularly if they've been estranged from their family. And what I would like to say is that there are some specialist services around, like Drummond Street Services. I know that there is a new LGBTIQ community legal centre operating out of St Kilda, and there's also Thornton Harbour, which has a family violence unit. And I know that in these communities, this issue is not talked about or raised. It seems to be a bit taboo, but it is important to talk about. And we should support people from those communities who are older, who are being subjected to elder abuse. Okay, getting back to the case study. Because of the stressful situation, Vasilios presents at the hospital ED with Violet and Vasilios presents at the hospital ED with Violet and their son Robert. Robert explains to the triage nurse that Vasilios in the past 2 days has been feeling confused, dizzy, and has been having headaches. This morning, Vasilios woke up and was having difficulty breathing. After the treating doctor attends to Vasilios in the cubicle and examines him, Robert talks with the ED nurse and explains that Petros is living with them and has had an intervention order served on him 2 years ago. However, Petros's parents are not aware of the IVO. They are barely surviving financially because they loaned Petros a lot of money and he hasn't repaid it. Petros is often withdrawn and despondent, and on the same days doesn't get out of bed. Or on some days, sorry. Robert explains that he can't become too involved because he's a bit fearful of Petros and what he might be capable of, and he doesn't want to put his family at risk. Robert explains that over the last year, Vasilios has stopped playing golf and swimming, and his health has worsened. So Karen, you're a member of Melbourne Health's Integrated Model of Care Steering Committee. Can you first say a little bit about that integrated model of care, and then how might staff in the emergency department respond to Vasilios' presentation at Melbourne Health?
Thank you, Gary. First I would say, when presented to Melbourne Health in the emergency department, the first thing the staff will do will be to take those concerns very seriously. So all of our staff, particularly our nursing staff, are trained in family violence, and this includes elder abuse. One of the first things that they would actually seek to do would be to speak to the patient alone. So if there is some that has disclosed the family violence concerns to his staff member, they would be seeking to speak to Vasilios by himself to actually gauge his situation, his level of concern about the situation, and they would be trying to make sure that conversation is patient-led. So not to say that they wouldn't necessarily believe Robert, but they would be wanting to speak to Vasilios alone. It may also be that, not in this case, but it could even be that Robert was a perpetrator of family violence or elder abuse. So the team would be seeking to speak to Vasilios in a confidential space and actually find out what his concerns were. If he presented to our emergency department at business hours on one weekday, he would be referred to social work and would work with one of our very well-trained social workers in family violence. If it was outside of business hours but up to 11 p.m, he'd get to speak one-on-one with a care coordinator as well. And they would also help to discuss the options within Melbourne Health, including our integrated model of care team. Our integrated model of care team has a number of different staff members involved with it. One thing they are able to offer is a family violence counselling service as well as a financial counselling service. So discussing the options through Melbourne Health in those regards would be discussed with the patient if he was interested in pursuing those. And if the patient was admitted to a ward, it sounds like he's got a number of medical concerns there as well. If he was admitted to a ward at Melbourne Health, he could continue to work both with the social worker but also in conjunction with the IMOC team as well to start to work on some of those concerns around both the financial elder abuse but also the physical concerns as well, having Petros in the house. So it would probably depend on whether he was being discharged from ED or whether he was being admitted as an inpatient, but either way, he continued to work with our IMOC team.
Great. Okay. Alright, so as it turns out, Vasilios is kept in hospital for a few days. Violet decides that she needs to be somewhere safe. So Robert says she can stay with him. During his stay, they do talk with the IMOC counsellor, who quickly establishes rapport with them. The IMOC counsellor seeks some advice from Seniors Rights Victoria and links Vasilios and Violet into their service. Karen, just going back to you, before he leaves hospital, a discharge plan is discussed. Given his current home situation, what might be some of the discussion in the discharge plan?
So I think safety planning would be a big important key aspect for this particular case. Discussing with Vasilios but also with Violet some options for safety planning should the situation at home worsen. Bearing in mind that often the clients themselves are the experts on their situation and they might be able to identify what they think is the safest in terms of safety planning. It may be things like a way that they can quickly leave the house if they're worried about physical aggression or physical abuse, having a trusted family member or a friend within the community they can call and get access to pretty quickly, but also making sure that they're aware of the option to call the police if the situation does get really serious very quickly. So safety planning is always done on an individual basis, and we always try and make sure it's patient-led as well. So they're often the best people to provide options and workshop that with the social worker or the IMOC counsellor, depending on the situation.
Thank you very much. So after his hospital stay, Vasilius returns to his home. Violet returns home as well. After they return home, Tony, you contact the couple, and one of the things you're concerned about is the presence of Petros in the home. What will you say to Violet when she answers the telephone? We're just reading the board down here. It's a bit tricky, isn't it? Yeah.
Thank you, Gary. So when I actually read Violet, first of all, I would identify who I am and where I'm from. And the first thing I ask is it okay for me to speak with her at the moment? And the reason for that is what Carolyn's just mentioned is touched on the safety aspects. We don't want actually to put Violet at more risk in terms of Petros being there. So that would be the first thing that I actually to check and make sure it's okay to be able to have a conversation.
Okay. Okay, so it is okay to go ahead with the conversation. Violet says she can talk with you now and explains that the situation is difficult. However, she thinks that she and Vasilius would like to talk with Seniors Rights Victoria in person. So how will you meet this request, Tony, given the COVID-19 restrictions?
Thank you, Gary. I'll explain to Violet that we're still continuing to provide our telephone information and advice service during the COVID-19 restrictions. That unfortunately we won't be able to actually meet with them face-to-face due to the COVID-19, but we can actually provide a telephone advice appointments. So when I'm actually booking the advice appointment for Violet and Vasilios, I will actually be checking with them when it's be the best time, the safest time to contact them, given that Petros is actually living at home with them. Also I would book that appointment. I'll then also provide the name of the lawyer and the advocate who will actually be giving them the telephone call at a particular date and time. Also too, just a bit of a tip, and this is just what's happened recently, is that if they feel that at that particular point in time that they can't actually take the call, what they could actually do is just sort of say, I just need to duck down to the shops, because as we know, the restrictions are lifted now, so that they're actually now able to go down the shops to get some grocery shopping, and that they could actually possibly take the call given on their mobile phone in the car park of the shopping centre, which we've recently done at work anyway. So that way then Petros just thinks mum and dad's going down to get some groceries, when in fact we're there to have a conversation about their situation. Also too, I would be putting in my advice notes to the lawyer and the advocate that's actually been conducting the advice, that if a young male answers the phone to actually hang up, please also note to let them know that we won't be putting them at risk, because all of our phones are actually caller ID blocked, so it will come up as a private number. Also just to when the lawyer and the advocate do actually provide the advice session, that they will actually be checking in again if it's still okay for them to take the call, and also to understand that if Violet and Vasilios need to terminate the call, that's quite okay.
Okay. So just continuing that, because I know we're running a little short of time in this session, what might be some of the advice and actions that Seniors Rights Victoria take in consultation with Vasilius and Violet when they ring back for that appointment?
Also, too, I forgot to mention that we'd also check to see if Vasilios is compressed to see whether or not he actually requires an interpreter, which we can organise at free cost as well. So in relation to the advice and areas that we could cover is they mentioned that they're in financial difficulty, so we could talk to them about the possibility of having a warm referral done to a financial counsellor, if that's what they would like, and explain what's involved with that. Also too, we do some discussion around the loan. Previously did a loan to Petros back in a couple of years ago, which he hasn't repaid, so that's something that we could speak to them about as well. Also too, about exploring the relationship they have with Petros, pre him moving in, and also how that's changed since he has moved in. Also too, and I know Auntie, you mentioned this, that the family, is not big at looking at mediation, but I mean that is something that we would always raise with them as well, and explain what that's involved. So that's always an option that we, particularly with the relationship with Petros. Also too, we would explore what their current formal and informal support networks are, so we've got an idea around that as well. And also it's to clarify what their ideal outcome would be, you know, in terms of what you could possibly have as Petros and, with Vasilios and Violet, they could completely have two different outcomes. So they might not be aware of that, so that's not an uncommon issue. But also too, and I think Carolyn, you've touched on it too, we go through the whole safety plan side of things as well as the physical safety, which you've sort of touched on as well. Also too, we'll be looking at the financial safety and also too the emotional and psychological safety, but also too we have booklets on that as well, or help sheets that we could send out to them. It's not safe to send it to their home somewhere, which maybe to their other son's home as well, Gary.
And presumably they could make the call to you when they have that consultation from Robert's place as well. If it was
Absolutely.
Yes.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yep.
Great. All right, I'm going to sort of jump along a bit. So Vasilios and Violet take up the offer of speaking to a financial counsellor who arranges to have the debt reduced on the credit card and the interest waived. The financial counsellor also arranges a realistic repayment plan in consultation with Vasilios and Violet. This relieves some of their stress. An offer of mediation to Petros is refused by him, and he doesn't take up the offer of accessing other services. Initially, the situation seems calm at the residence of Vasilios and Violet. However, over the next 6 months, Petros becomes more aggressive towards his parents. Vasilios and Violet contact Seniors Rights Victoria again and tell their caseworkers that they need to obtain the intervention order. So Tony, what will happen now?
Thank you, Gary. So what we'll do in that particular advice session is that our lawyer would actually outline the intervention order process to Violet and Vasilios and what to expect during that process. Also too, as an advocate, I'll be checking with Violet and Vasilios if they have any identified support person to assist them through this process, because it is actually quite a traumatic process to do that in terms of taking out the intervention order, because we know that this has been, I suppose, the last resort for Violet and Vasilios, so it's really important that they have a support person, whether that be, like for example, their other son Robert, that may be able to assist them with that process, Gary. And if they can't identify anyone that they feel comfortable doing that, then there's certainly something that Seniors Rights Victoria would provide assistance with if that's what they're choosing.
Okay, so the order is granted, and you've gone through the court process with Violet and Vasilios, and they've said to you that they think that Petros will be a bit difficult to remove from the house, that he might become a bit aggressive. I'm assuming that what you would do in that case is you would contact the police.
Mm-hmm.
Yes? Okay.
Yes.
And so you've contacted Tash.
Mm-hmm.
And so Tash, how are you going to respond to this situation with Vasilios and Violet and Petros?
So there's a couple of things, I guess, to be aware of from a police response perspective in relation to this particular case study. And firstly, Victoria Police would be aware of the intervention order if it had an exclusion condition, because the court will provide that to us, and we will already be in the process of making arrangements to serve that order. Naturally, where there's an exclusion condition in place, we put some process around that in terms of giving people the ability to remove property and personal effects and things like that. So we always make allowances for that. If Seniors Rights were to contact me and provide this level of information in relation to the aggression and those sorts of things that have occurred in this environment with this family, it would prompt Victoria Police to do a family violence risk assessment, to do a family violence report, because essentially the Family Violence Protection Act stipulates that Victoria Police can and will investigate family violence wherever it's reported to us in whatever capacity. And there are a number of factors present within this family relationship that are of concern. There's a lot of controlling behaviour, there's the aggression and the threats or potential threats that have occurred. We know that he's got a propensity for violence given the relationship with his ex-wife and the fact that there's already an intervention order in place. There's some suicide, self-harm risks that have come up, there's the financial abuse. So we would go through a comprehensive risk assessment with the family, with both mum and dad and also speaking to Petros himself. And then make a decision as to, there's obviously already an intervention order in place, but it's much more preferable if police are the applicant for that order. So in certain circumstances, we would become the applicant, we would actually alter the intervention order application representation at court so that we're the applicant. And that takes a little bit of the responsibility and burden away from the parents, away from Vasilios and Violet, because then police are prosecuting this matter. And it allows us to provide some support and to tailor the conditions of the intervention order in consultation with the family to make sure that that the conditions suit their particular circumstances. So, for instance, if they didn't want Petros excluded from the home, that doesn't necessarily mean that he has to be, just to have the intervention order in place. Obviously, we would go through the process of serving the intervention order, and that also includes providing some information and support referral services to Petros, and potentially facilitating or assisting him to facilitate alternate housing. We can't share information back with your service, with Seniors Rights Victoria, but we can share services, we can share information in relation to family violence risk with a lot of other services and information sharing entities such as the health sector and mental health services and things like that. So we might make those inquiries as well. And obviously, once the family violence report is made and some of these circumstances where aggression and the like has been explained to us, then we would investigate whether there's any criminality associated with these behaviours.
Thanks very much, Tash. Well, Petros is removed from the home, which is very upsetting for Vasilios and Violet. These things are never easy. And Seniors Rights Victoria will be there to support them during this process. They still love him, that hasn't waned, and although they saw no other option, they would like to have some sort of relationship with him. One of the police officers who assisted with serving the IVO has kept in contact with Violet to let her know that Petros is housed and is safe. This reassures his parents. However, 6 months after the IVO has been served, the relationship with Petros hasn't been re-established. This case study was de-identified and adapted from the files of Seniors Rights Victoria. It is representative of some of the issues that occur for older people when they are subjected to abuse. In our discussion this morning, we've seen that prevention can play an important part in avoiding such situations. Responding to elder abuse often involves, as we've seen, the support and assistance of many organisations and agencies with expertise, as well as other families such as Rob. We should always keep in mind that older people have rights and that they should be able to live in dignity and with respect. And on that note, I'd like to thank each of our panel members who have brought a vast amount of expertise here this morning. Tash from Victoria Police, Tony from Seniors Rights Victoria, Michelle from the Southern Melbourne Elder Abuse Prevention Network, Tinos Doulos-Statopoulos from Pronia, and Caroline from Melbourne Health. Thank you very much for your contributions this morning. We're now going to open it up to questions and answers. Okay, so I would also invite Joe back in to answer some questions as well if they come up. And also we have Angelica here, who's one of the lawyers from Seniors Rights Victoria for legal questions. One of the things that I do want to say is that if your question isn't answered in this particular section, please contact our helpline on 1300 368 821, and if it's to a specific person, then say that, and we will be able to contact that person and present the question to them after the session today. So the first question is, with the popularity of 6 thumbs up, as we know, capacity is decision specific. Why then do police routinely not proceed with elder abuse cases involving people with the diagnosis of dementia? Cash, do you want to answer that?
Yeah, sure. So I guess firstly I'd just like to clarify that we don't routinely not proceed with elder abuse cases where there's a diagnosis of dementia. In fact, the Family Violence and Protection Act gives us the ability to bring a prosecution or to make an application for an intervention order or serve safety notices and the like, where capacity is, where there are limitations on capacity, cognitive impairments, mental illness, or where there is somebody, a child, somebody under 18. So we don't need consent in those circumstances. But we absolutely would do a comprehensive risk assessment in relation to somebody who has dementia or any other cognitive impairment and assess those additional vulnerability factors. That would quite often escalate the matter to our family violence investigation unit, so a team of detectives who respond to family violence, so it gets a more comprehensive assessment of risk. So it actually elevates our response as opposed to diminishes it.
Okay. Thank you very much. Okay, so we have a general question. What do you think are the main causes of elder abuse? And I'll open this up to the panel, because you might bring some expertise in this from the particular context in which you work. So who would like to start? Tony.
At the heart of elder abuse, and I know it's been raised before on the panel, is actually ageism. Ageism in terms of the ageist attitudes, and I think touched on it earlier in on the so that's what it's actually for. And there are just many forms of elder abuse, but I actually think at the heart of it is actually is ageist attitude by society in terms of not respecting, not honouring, not allowing older people to through a certain age, and even if they do have a diagnosis of dementia, people still can make choices. So it's around moving from a protectionist approach to a human rights approach. So until society starts to focus on that, I think elder abuse will still continue, unfortunately.
All right. Do any of the other panel members want to contribute to that question? Tina? Yeah, great. Just following our sound recorders down. She's been great, hasn't she? What's her name? Steph. Well done, Steph.
We have found that some of the common issues that are reported is family breakdown, mental health, alcohol addictions or drug addictions that have impacted the way that people relate to each other. We also find that inheritance in patients seems to be a very big issue that's happening at the moment, where financially the parents or the elderly people are being pressured into making decisions or signing for something that they're not familiar with. So it's about what the person is able to gain themselves, and some of the reasons for that is about them needing to support themselves. Family breakdown, we tend to see that many of the older adult children tend to go back home rather than looking for other options. So the dynamics of the family actually then change, and what is happening in the home and the pressures that are there are intensified. And often not knowing where to reach out for services, you find that a lot of the impact on the older person is much greater.
I think Caroline wants to say a few things as well.
I can add a little bit there. I think it's been covered actually extremely well by two respondents already, but I would certainly agree things like inheritance in patients, but also mental health issues and drug and alcohol impacts as well. Unfortunately, the case study that we talked about today seems to be one that's relatively typical. Often there is actually family violence in the person's immediate family unit, usually with their partner and children, and often when that situation breaks down and the older parents take them in, family violence continues to be perpetrated against the parents, and that may have not previously been present when the person was perhaps younger or a teenager, when they were last living with the adults. The relationships and the dynamics have changed. So I think certainly ageism definitely, I think financial pressure, mental health, and also just gender inequality as well. So starting the behaviour with your spouse and your children and behaving that way, treating them that way, behaviour that can get continued over when those older adults return home to the older adults.
Just if we could just very quickly, from our experience, we see that 75% of the cases that we deal with, it's the adult son that's abusive towards the mother, the older woman within the home, and we find that many of the cases the person is a widow. This woman is usually a widow, so there are some complex issues that are happening there, and we also find that the women don't want to reach out, don't want to take any action against their adult child, because they are the ones that they're having the relationship with, so that codependency intergenerational abuse is not very well understood.
I think we should also say too that in a scoping study that was done by the Australian Institute of Family Studies across 3 helplines in Victoria, Queensland, New South Wales, about a quarter of the people who were being subjected to elder abuse were older men. And so this is one of the differences with typical family violence where men are usually the perpetrators. What we see in elder abuse is that men can also be the victim survivors as well. I'd also like to say that, the other thing to talk about, we didn't talk about it much in the case study, but is the definition of family. Under the Family Violence Act in Victoria, it's quite broad. And I know, for example, in my community, the LGBTIQ community, that defining family may not always be a biological context. It might be identifying people who they see as family and who they identify as family. And so under the Family Violence Act, that is included as well. We've got a question for you, Joe, and as the sun starts shining through, it's getting a bit more harder to read. But let's see how we go. Hi, Joe. There you go. It's calling you by their first name. How do you respect an older person's wishes who has dementia, but her husband continues to harm her?
That's not an easy question to answer in a short space of time. I think it's trying to understand the situation and what is meant by the term harm. I think if I would just go back to the case briefly that we discussed, the things I'd be interested in is the family dynamic. So I'd be interested whether Petrus was the firstborn son and did he have the first grandchild, and was the first grandchild a boy? And was he a good son? And so does his mum think that he's redeemable? What's the relationship? Is the mum the negotiator between the father and the son as to what is the dynamic? What do they want to preserve? Do they want to preserve a relationship with the person or not? And remember that the family is a reflection of self. So if my son is bad, does that mean I've been a bad parent? And will I be willing to say that? If we come now to, did I marry the wrong person? Why am I hurting the person that I've married and love? What does that make me as a partner? Am I acting in a way that I think is protective and other people are seen as harmful? So if I'm locking my loved one in the house because they have dementia, I'm worried that they're going to leave, I think I'm protecting them, others think I'm restricting their practice. If it's regarding consensual sexual behaviour, there's really quite different issues there. If a person is demanding, in a sense, conjugal rights which are not appropriate, if a person has dementia and cannot give consent, if it's related to finance or psychology, you then need to understand the relationship leading up to that. And I think that understanding both parties and their relationship and what their goal is the way to start looking at a solution. But we actually also need the history leading up to it, because these things don't happen overnight. And if Petrus is in his 40s, then the parents have been, that issue has been there for 40 years, and they may have seen signs that they should have addressed earlier that they now regret. The short answer is it's not acceptable for another person to harm someone else. That's the starting point. Understanding each person, their views, and what our role is the next step before we come to any immediate solution.
Great. Okay, I'll just let you know that Jared's giving me the wind up. So shall we stop the questions there? Okay, we've got time for one more question. And Joe, this will bring you in. All right? I know you're a bit surprised about this, but I thought we'd better get a question for you rather than just sitting there. So this question roughly is, many older Victorians live in residential aged care. I know that at Seniors Rights Victoria, we have people come to us who are resident in aged care, and sometimes they'll be being abused or mistreated because of the misuse of an enduring power of attorney. And sometimes that will be sort of endorsed in a way, implicitly by the residential aged care provider. What can we do in that situation? I mean, maybe be a bit more general about how we could actually deal with that generally.
So, enduring powers of so do you mean if someone comes to us as a
yeah, so I suppose we can...
sorry.
So I'll make the question a little bit more specific. We do know in residential aged care that if abuse or mistreatment is perpetrated by volunteers, management or staff, that comes under Commonwealth jurisdiction. There are mandatory reporting requirements. But I understand that Seniors Rights Victoria can be involved with a resident in an aged care facility if they're being abused by or mistreated by someone who is a family member or a relative. Is that right? And how do we do that?
Okay. So, yeah, we do commonly receive inquiries from people living in residential care, and they may have an enduring power of attorney in place, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they don't have decision-making capacity. An enduring power of attorney may have specific conditions that they only come into effect when someone does lose decision-making capacity, but even an enduring power of attorney, if it has come into effect, they still need to consult with the person. But sometimes people come up and approach Seniors Rights with concerns that they're not being kept informed of their finances, their visitors, they're not allowed specific visitors that they still want. So when they contact Seniors Rights, we'll make an assessment of their capacity to give instructions, and if we feel they've got capacity to give instructions, then we'll assist them to have their wishes fulfilled, because with an enduring power of attorney, the attorney is supposed to act in accordance with the person's personal preferences and wishes. So that's how we can assist to help them to still achieve those. So we would ensure the enduring power of attorney is aware of their obligations. So that's probably the first step, make sure they're aware of their obligations with a view to encouraging them to act in accordance, and if they don't, then there may be then we would provide further advice, but that would be the first step.
Thanks very much, Angelica. I know we put you under a lot of pressure then because you only had a minute. But as I said before, if people have got questions after this, and we're going to conclude this panel discussion now, to contact the telephone helpline at Seniors Rights Victoria, which is 1300 368 821, and we can answer your questions for you or direct them to the panel member concerned. I'd like to again thank all the panel members today and thank the audience for participating in this. And before we finish, I'm going to hand back to Jared Mansell. Thank you, Jared.
Thank you very much, Gary, and all panel members for the great gymnastic effort of handing around the microphone. It's much appreciated. Look, we've got an important closing message now from the Minister for Prevention of Family Violence, the Honourable Gabrielle Williams.
Thank you all for taking part in today's seminar. World Elder Abuse Awareness Day gives us a chance to pause and focus on elder abuse as a public health and a human rights issue. Elder abuse is a form of family violence, and it needs to be properly recognised and addressed. There's simply no place for it in our community. By understanding elder abuse, we can make a real difference to the lives of older people, particularly those who may be suffering in silence behind closed doors. And this is especially important during these difficult times. We know that negative age stereotypes contribute to a culture where older people are afforded less power and control. We need to change these social attitudes to prevent elder abuse from happening in the first place. That's why the Victorian Government is proud to continue to support our state's elder abuse prevention networks. We're providing an additional $300,000 for these networks to ensure their vital work will continue throughout this year. These networks bring together community groups, organisations and businesses to help raise awareness of and stop elder abuse from occurring in the first place. I'm also pleased to support Respect Victoria's Respect Older People Call It Out campaign, which is running again this year. It calls on the community to help identify the early signs of elder abuse and to take steps to respond, because we all need to play our part to help keep Victorians safe. Thank you for your commitment and ongoing advocacy for the prevention of elder abuse.
Thank you very much everyone for tuning into the webinar today. We all have a role we can play. I know many of you connect with social media, many of you do regular posts on Twitter and Facebook, and I'd just like to bring to your attention that myself as Commissioner, I have a Facebook page. You can contact many organisations like Seniors Rights Victoria and other organisations here through social media platforms. As we move forward, see today as the beginning of a journey. The beginning of the journey is for each of us to recommit to prevention of elder abuse. We can all make a difference in the lives of the people that are close to us. We can make a massive difference as professionals in the lives of older people that come to us. One of the most important things we've learned today is that older people won't easily disclose abuse in their lives, particularly if it's about their adult son and their adult children or their grandchildren. So please take away today an increased commitment that we'll do all we can as professionals, we'll do all we can as individuals to help prevent elder abuse in the long term. Thank you.